This is Vermeer's Woman with a Balance. It's been called a number of things. The woman weighing gold until they cleaned it and decided that what she actually had in her balance was pearls. And so sometimes it's called a woman weighing pearls. But it's a woman with a balance, a scale. And as you can see, she's standing in this room with a table with jewelry on top. Her jewel box is open, and all of these pearls and other jewelry are sort of cascading out. And behind her is a painting on the wall. And it's a painting of the Last Judgment. It looks like it might be a 16th century Last Judgment. Vermeer was not only an artist, but an art dealer. And he sold not only his own works of art, but sometimes other works of art. So we think that some of the paintings that are in the background of Vermeer's paintings are actual paintings. Sometimes they can be identified. I don't think this one has been found or identified. But they may have been not just pictures on the wall, but part of his stock in trade. So if someone wanted to buy this, then they would be available. In the meantime, he can use it to add meaning to the work of art. And as you see, she's standing before a painting of the Last Judgment. You can see, in very freely painted brushstrokes, Christ in an aureole of light with the apostles on either side. And down below, we have the resurrection of the dead, the people who have come out of their graves and are about to be judged. Now, it's pretty interesting where she's standing. She's standing right below Christ. She's holding a balance. And for people who know the iconography of the Last Judgment, and that would pretty much be the Christian community of the Renaissance and the Baroque period, so whoever would be looking at it, this has a particular reference. And I'm showing you a detail out of a Last Judgment by Rogier van der Weyden. And you can see Christ in light, seated on the rainbow. And right below him is St. Michael the Archangel. And St. Michael the Archangel is holding a giant balance in which are portrayed, and they're labeled so we know, virtue, it says virtu, the Latin, and peccata, or sin. So the virtuous and sinful parts of the person who's being weighed in the balance. And that idea of weighing someone in the balance refers to the idea that at the Last Judgment, your sins and your virtues will be weighed and will determine whether you're going to be spending eternity in heaven or in hell. The woman is standing in St. Michael's place. St. Michael is weighing souls. The woman is weighing pearls. Now, pearls sometimes are used as a symbol for the soul. And of course, pearls are precious items. So they might refer to something that's very precious, such as spirituality. On the other hand, pearls are jewels. They're worldly things. They're things that, people have extra money, wealthy, dress up, and rather than give the money to the poor to help people. So what could be the meaning here? Well, it's not exactly clear. It's not exactly prescribed exactly how you could interpret this. And I think that's something that's very true of Vermeer, that he doesn't have just only one meaning, but perhaps people would look at this picture and they might derive their own meanings from it. But certainly there's some things that are suggested here. There is some kind of contrast of spiritual and earthly values going on. There's some kind of contrast of spiritual and earthly values going on. So what kind of interpretations might someone have? Someone could look at this and they could say, and they could see the woman as standing in the place of St. Michael weighing pearls. And they could think about the pearls being equivalent symbolically to the human soul, the human spirit, and think this is a reminder that someday my soul will be weighed in the balance, and I must, be good. I must be virtuous. I must pay more attention to spiritual matters. Or could it be a contrast where the woman is paying attention to the pearls, something that is worldly, something that will not help you get into heaven, worldly things, vanity, and she's just oblivious to what's going on behind her, not even thinking about the fact that these are simply worldly things to have gems. Well, I think we could think of a lot of different ways to interpret this, but it does make you start thinking about spiritual values, earthly values, and if you are a Christian and believe in the Last Judgment, which probably almost anybody who would have seen this picture, the person who would have purchased it and put it up in his house, would have undoubtedly been familiar with the story and probably believed that his soul would be in jeopardy if he did not follow the proper spiritual values. So it becomes a kind of reminder, as well as a genre picture, just a woman, evaluating how much her jewelry is worth, or is it a moral message? And a moral message is perfectly fine in a Protestant household. There's no danger that you're going to worship the image of the woman with a balance. It's telling you a story. It's like a parable or a genre painting with a moral message. Vermeer also painted a view of Delft. Now, this is his home city. So this is a kind of landscape, a cityscape. And when you look at this picture, you see a number of things going on. You might notice that it's about 2/3 clouds. Something over half of the space is filled up with the clouds, which are, of course, amorphous, but come in at a kind of horizontal, going across the sky, rather than how we often see in Rysdale's pictures, where you have this great cumulus clouds coming in at the diagonal. Now, that repeats the very peaceful mood of the horizontal elements, which are the city itself. You see the horizontal ridge lines of the houses. You see the wall. You see a bridge. You see the edge of the quay. And then at the foreground, you have, starts out sort of horizontal, and there's just a gentle curve of the the edge before the water, the shore before the water. And then there are small vertical elements, because if everything were horizontal, it'd be utterly boring. So you have the towers of the buildings. You have the people here who are standing in the foreground. They're very, very tiny people in relationship to the house, in relationship to the building. So this is quite a different kind of landscape than you would see in, say, Renaissance art, where you might see, for example, the Mona Lisa with a landscape behind her. The human being there dominates. Here, it's nature, the clouds, and of course the things that man has created, the buildings. Now, there might be something else about this nice, peaceful image of Delft that refers to a contemporary event. If we look at the bridge there, and there seems to be a kind of an open space behind it. Well, I heard a conference paper given about this once, and the speaker said that bridge is actually longer, more horizontal than it would be if we actually go and look at the bridge. But just beyond it, that kind of open space, there was a horrible catastrophe. The armory was there, and it was filled with gunpowder, and it exploded. It blew up. It took out the houses around it and left a great crater in the ground. He actually showed some 17th century pictures of the crater that had been painted. So this was very bad publicity for Delft. It made it seem like, it's not very safe. So he suggested that Vermeer has exaggerated the length of the bridge, making it more horizontal to suggest peaceful, calm, safe, as though saying, yes, we had a catastrophe, but Delft is a very safe place to live. It's very peaceful, it's calm. Oh yes, and once they rebuilt it, the armory blew up again, but he's not showing that. You might notice it looks like there are some sort of white spots on the building, little deft touches of paint. And we can see that here as well. Those may be the circles of confusion that you see in a camera obscura. Or they may just simply be deft touches of paint that suggest light reflections and enliven the surface. Portraits were also extremely popular during the period of the Dutch Baroque. As people became very prosperous, they wanted to have their portraits painted. And we have not only individual portraits or portraits of a family, but we also have group portraits, which could be a family, but could also be some kind of organization. First, we're going to look at a 16th century group portrait, and then we'll see how that develops from simply the row of heads into very active compositions of the Baroque group portrait. So here's this group portrait from the 16th century. I'm not going to make you know the artist's name for this. I just want to show it to you. It's an organization, and they're having their annual banquet, and it's pretty much like a yearbook picture. And I'm sure you've seen pictures of classes where everybody sort of sits in a row, and the tall people stand behind the short people. And sometimes when people are taking a picture of their group, that's what they do. They just have a row of people standing there or sitting there. In this case, they've tried to put it in a context. Hey, we're having our annual banquet, or our weekly banquet, or however often they meet. But you do have just sort of basically a row of heads, so everybody can be recognized and say, see, there I am, to any of their friends and relatives who might happen to see this picture. But it's like a yearbook. Now, when I was in school, usually the art clubs decided that they did not want to have just a row of heads or a row of standing figures the way other clubs did. And sometimes for our yearbook pictures, we did strange things. In one case, we had somebody climbing on a ladder, or as though they were pretending to paint another person who was holding a frame around their neck, just things to liven it up. Now we're going to see how the Dutch Baroque did that. We're first going to talk about an artist named Frans HALS. And these two pictures aren't in your book, but I just wanted to emphasize a point. That he was very well known for his painterly brushstrokes, very, very free painting. And he would paint a lot of portraits, and here just some individual figures. The one would not have been a commissioned portrait. It's in France, it's in the Louvre, and so it's called La Bohème, the Bohemian, probably a bar girl, something like that, just a casual picture. And then here, another man who is gesturing and very, very, very freely painted. Well, now we're going to look at one of Frans HALS' group portraits. This is the group portrait of the Militia Company of St. Adrian. And so I need to explain what these militia companies are. And many of them were named after a saint. So that would just a way of designating them. For example, he also painted the Militia Company of St. George. But this one's St. Adrian's. You'll remember that the Netherlands had been formed in the latter part of the 16th century, so relatively recently to this picture. They'd been formed by a war between Spain and what became the Kingdom of the Netherlands. It was a religious war. The Spanish had brought in the Inquisition. Many of the people in the Netherlands were Protestant, Calvinist, And the result was a war that ended up splitting the lowlands, so that the north part of the lowlands, or the Netherlands, became a country that we today call, and was called then, the Kingdom of the Netherlands. And it's, as we said, predominantly Protestant. So who drove out the Spanish? Well, in large part, it was militia companies. And so you could kind of think of these, not 100% anyway, but sort of like the panache that maybe the Minutemen would have had in colonial America. You know, you fought with the Minutemen, you drove out the English. Or maybe a little bit like the National Guard, somebody to be called out to protect the country, and to be called out, well, in fact, they sometimes were using what we might call police actions, you know, if there were riots or something. So, you know, to help preserve civil peace. So the militia company were, because they're very prestigious. And to be an officer in a militia company was also a very prestigious position. So here they are, the officers are gathered around a banqueting table, and they're having their banquet. Only here the emphasis is not so much on that table. It's not tipped up, it seemed, from a natural point of view. We can see some of the objects on the table, a little still life. But most of our emphasis here is on the figures, the human beings. But they're not lined up like a row of heads. There's a variety of poses. Some people are standing, maybe they finished the banquet. Some people are seated, so they're turned various ways, although always we can see their faces. That would be extremely important. If you're an officer, you want to be shown in the picture. And we actually have this one figure here who has his sort of hand on his hip and his elbow projecting out, foreshortened, at us, and he's turned around and he's looking at us. He's down there in the lower right, and it's like we've walked into the room. You might notice that the standing man on the left also seems to be looking out at us. So we're directly connected. We're almost part of the picture. The viewer seems to be being viewed by the people who are in the painting. You can also see that Hals has decided to use diagonal movement to enliven a subject that essentially is people standing around and seated around a table. And so he uses the flag, you know, the great banner that would be the company's banner. And somebody is bearing that, he's holding that, and he's holding it in a diagonal. And then, of course, we can see that the figures are arranged somewhat in two diagonals, the one that follows the flag, and then where you see the standing man as kind of the apex of a right-angled triangle. It's not rigidly a triangle, just enough to order the composition and to give you a sense of movement. Undoubtedly, the most famous of all the Dutch Baroque painters today would be Rembrandt van Rijn. And we just call him by his first name. It's like Michelangelo. We just say Rembrandt rather than Mr. van Rijn. He is known for his dramatic tenebrism, that very strong contrast of light and dark. He uses, in his mature works, he uses almost exclusively very warm hues. Generally, they seem to be kind of a warm brown with golden tones, and sometimes reddish browns, and sometimes oranges. They always remind me of the embers of a fire. And I think that adds to the intimacy of the pictures. He uses very painterly brushstrokes, very freely applied. He's definitely a naturalistic Baroque artist. He uses a great deal of naturalism. Even when he does classical themes, some people are not always sure whether he's spoofing them or not, because the figures are so naturalistic. We won't be showing you any of those. They're a small part of his very large oeuvre, or body of work. And what makes Rembrandt someone that is so revered today in painting is not only his technique, which of course is the way he conveys human feeling. You often feel like you're looking at a real person who has had sorrows, who's not perfect, but has the dignity of being a human being. When he does biblical subjects, which once again they're not showing you in the text, you think of these people as real people, not as sort of plaster saints acting out a famous story. So let's look at one of his group portraits. He painted many group portraits. In fact, he painted 2 anatomy pictures. And what these are medical class portraits. This one's known as the anatomy lesson of Dr. Tulp, who is the professor here. He is the doctor. And this also illustrates that idea that during the 17th century, there was more and more interest in scientific matters. So here they are actually being able to dissect a body. There were limits on who they could dissect and how long and how many bodies, but still the medical class is learning from observation of a particular body. And you can see here he's showing the muscles of the arms. And the students are very intrigued by this. Some are leaning very, very close. So, this is the rise of science in the 17th century. Science as we mean it today, not just scientia knowledge, but the empirical sciences. In this case, biology and medicine. The natural sciences. And now I want to show you probably the most famous group portrait of all. The most famous of all of Rembrandt's group portraits is the Militia Company of Captain Banning Cocq, or just abbreviate here to the Company of Captain Cocq, also known as the Night Watch. Now, this is a very, very large picture, and it is an active group portrait. Rather than having people lined up or seated around a table, he actually has the militia company getting ready to march. They're not lined up yet. You've got a man beating on a drum, and so you can almost hear the sound, perhaps. Calling the company to order. Somebody's trying to unfurl the flag. The pikes and spears are all sort of in disarray. And then the musketeers are readying their guns. They're getting ready to march. Incidentally, I said this was a very large painting. It's actually been cut down. There once was more to it. Why was it called the Night Watch? Well, it's an oil painting on canvas, and generally these oil paintings are covered with varnish to give it a luster and to seal the surface and protect the paint below. But over time, varnishes become dark. So by the 18th, the 19th century, it seemed to be a night scene. It seemed to be very, very dark. And so people started calling it the Night Watch, thinking that it was the militia company being called out to handle some kind of crisis that was going on at night. But then they cleaned the painting in the 20th century. And the joke among the art historians was that, it's no longer the Night Watch, now it's the Late Afternoon Watch. Of course, people didn't really start calling it that. It's now called the Militia Company of Captain Cocq, who is the captain of the company, and right there in the foreground. Now, one of the things you may have noticed is there are hidden faces, and here you see a detail of a man who's, you see his hat and his eyes, and somebody's hand is in front of his face. And if we look throughout this picture, we'll see a number of figures that are way in the background. They're partially hidden. Sometimes the faces are really fuzzy. You really can't make out the features. And there was someone who thought, evidently he misread a document or just made some false assumptions. But what he thought were that these were people who were being represented and they had to pay for the painting and they were very dissatisfied, and this is what destroyed Rembrandt's reputation and eventually caused him to go into bankruptcy. Well, actually, none of that is true. There is documentation on this painting, and it tells who painted it. It tells what the it tells what the painting cost, which was a very large amount, and it tells who painted it. And if you look at the names of the people who contributed, and then can you see up there in the background? There's a large oval. It looks like a big framed oval hanging from the wall in the upper, just off center. That cartouche, as it's often called, lists the names of the people who are portrayed in the picture and who paid for the painting. It has Captain Banning Cocq, who is, of course, in the foreground with the red sash, and his lieutenant, who is right next to him in yellow, and other people. And if you count them up, you'll find that the faces that are very clear correspond to the number of people who actually paid for it. The other figures are simply, extras. They're just figures that he's put in to embellish them. They're probably not really real people, and so they can't really get angry. They didn't pay anything to be included. It's just making the picture seem more lively. We always talk about movies with a cast of thousands. Well, it's not thousands, but it's a few extras here. Also, Rembrandt remained a very popular portrait painter after this painting. It was many, many years later when he had his financial troubles. Evidently, he was not very good with money. He did buy a lot of things and had a sort of a museum of interesting things, including paintings. And he had a copy, for example, of a painting by Raphael of the Castiglione, a very famous writer and courtier of the 16th century. He had a copy of this Raphael. He had Persian miniatures. He had shells. So he had a lot of so he had virtually a private museum. And at one point, evidently, the style that was favored was not his, and he didn't get as many commissions, and he did go into bankruptcy. But that's later. At this time, and directly after this painting was painted, he was a very prominent and prosperous artist. One of the things he painted throughout his life were self-portraits. Well, he's certainly a cheap model. He doesn't have to pay himself. In fact, sometimes he uses his wife, Saskia, and other members of his household, either as the models or, because he wants a portrait of them. And I just showed you a few. We have many portraits of him throughout his life, from the time he's a young man to when he's perhaps in his 30s, as he's getting older. And then we have a number of these old age portraits. By our standards, maybe he's more middle-aged. Perhaps he's, perhaps he's in his 50s. But he does have the appearance of age. And of course, this is in the 17th century when the life expectancy was not quite as great as it is today with modern medicine. So these are his old age self-portraits. And your book is illustrating one that's in the Frick collection, in which he's shown there with some kind of staff and a cape thrown over his shoulders. This is really fancy dress. He had a lot of props around his studio. And so, he could dress the model up, or in this case himself up, to represent figures from other times, perhaps, or exotic figures, perhaps biblical kings or something like that. But his self-portraits are particularly prized. And here this certainly illustrates the things that we've talked about, his style, the tenebrism. You have this very dark room, a shadowy area. And then the figure emerges in the light. So you have that light and dark contrast. The hues are very warm. You have deep, dark browns, and then these sort of golden hues in the garment, and the sort of orange sash, which is not garish at all because it's not fully saturated, but it, once again, I say it gives the feeling of the embers of a fire and sets up a warmth and intimacy. And here are some details, and you can see how extremely free his brushstrokes are. They are brushstrokes as brushstrokes. I'm also going to show you another one of his old age self-portraits. This one was made the next year. And it's in the National Gallery in Washington. It was in previous editions of the text. And in this case, he's wearing his ordinary clothing. And I think in both of these, if you look at the faces of Rembrandt, you really get that sense of human feeling, someone who's had sorrows in his life, but isn't weeping about them. Someone who's had sorrows in his life, but faces them with dignity, as though there really is this human spark, even in the face of adversity. And at the time that these were painted, he had some adversity. His beloved wife, Saskia, had died in 1642. 1656, he went through the bankruptcy, and his goods were sold off. That's why we know what was in the collection, because they still have those records. The worst was yet to come, in a sense, which of course he didn't know at this time. His beloved son, he had only one son named Titus, and Titus died shortly after his marriage in his early 20s, and did not leave a grandchild for Rembrandt. So that was probably the final blow in his family. He did have a long-term, we would call it a common law marriage, with Hendrika, his housekeeper. She was even called in, I guess, the church and told she should stop living with this painter. But I think for all intents and purposes, it was a common law marriage, and of long duration. The will, well, I should explain this. Saskia was from a wealthier family than Rembrandt. And if he remarried, he would lose his share of the inheritance. And he couldn't afford to do that. So this is probably why he did not remarry. But so we have a person who, is not a perfect person. He's an ordinary person. He's had sorrows, and it's shown very much in these pictures. And I think people do sympathize with it. I want to look at the technique too. We've talked about impasto before with Titian. And here you can see in the details that Rembrandt also builds up a thick paste of paint with these visible brushstrokes and very, very thick paint. And you can also see how the light works. This picture is almost entirely brown and tones of brown. And the light is the tenebrism. The background's dark, what he's wearing is dark, but light seems to emanate not from a hidden candle, not from a hidden window, but from his face, and then secondarily with his hands. And we always liken that to the light of the soul, or to the spirit, or the personality. Now, Rembrandt was also a printmaker. He worked predominantly with etching and Drypoint. And I just brought in, this is one of his early etchings, and you can see how it works with these very, very, very sketchy lines. Let me talk to you about how etching is created and then how Drypoint is created. And I should tell you there's a slight inaccuracy in this drawing. It shows the metal plate as being absolutely square, or not, absolutely rectangular. The edges would be beveled. In other words, there'd be sloping edges. And the edges would be also covered with the what we call the ground. The reason the edges would be beveled is that it has to go through a roller press, a printing press with a roller, and that would allow the plate to go under the roller without tearing, which if you tried to put something like this through a printing press, it just would probably tear the paper. That aside, we'll use the diagram. It shows a metal plate covered with a waxy ground. In the diagram it says varnish coating. Very frequently a combination of beeswax and asphaltum is used, but something that's impervious to acid. So you cover your surface with a waxy ground or a varnish, and then you take a etching needle or a stylus of some kind, and you just scratch through that ground. If it's waxy, it's very easy. You can be really scribbly about it. And that, of course, reveals the metal below. And then when you have your design completely sketched out, the metal is revealed where you want there to be dark lines. You would immerse the plate in a bath of acid. Now, these metal plates were usually copper. You can also use zinc or other metals, of course. The acid bites into the exposed metal. Every place that the metal is exposed to the acid, every place you scratch through the ground, the metal dissolves. And that leaves incised lines. Now, what if you want some lines darker and some lines lighter? You take it off, you rinse it out, and then you would put, they just sometimes call it stop-out varnish, or tush, or something that's waxy or varnishy that is impervious to the acid, and you paint over those lines that you have already etched, but you'd like to be lighter. And then you can put it back in the acid bath. And the acid can eat the exposed metal and make the lines that you've left exposed, make the lines deeper, and that means they will hold more ink. Okay, you finished. You take it out of the acid bath, you rinse it off, you use a solvent to remove the varnish or the beeswax, what we call the ground, whatever you used, and now you're ready to print. You would be using rag-based paper, probably moistened, and you would take your plate and cover it with ink, making sure it gets down into those grooves. And then you wipe the surface. You'll probably have a translucent tone of ink left on the surface, but you have to be careful that you leave the ink in the grooves. If you wipe it too much, it'll take the ink off completely. If you don't wipe it well enough, it'll just be dark everywhere. So you have to wipe it perfectly. It's a skill. And you leave the ink in the grooves, and then you take it to the printing press. Now, these are the printing presses with rollers on them, and they usually have a movable bed or movable flat surface that goes underneath the rollers. What you'll do is you'll take a blanket, we call them. It's actually a piece of felt, and you'll put it down on the bed or the horizontal part of the press. And usually you'll have something like newsprint over that to protect it. And then you would put your inked and wiped plate on that. And then you take your good rag paper that's been dampened and blotted, and you put it on top of the inked surface of the plate. And then you could put something else, as I said, like newsprint, just to protect the blanket. And then you put another blanket or piece of felt, or many pieces of felt sometimes, on top. And then you roll it through the printing press. And the rollers, you're exerting a great deal of force. You can't do this by hand, with just pressing with your hands. You need to have a press. So the rollers will press the felt, and especially will press the paper down into the grooves, and they pick up the ink. And then, of course, you can do it again and again, depending on what your print run is. If you're going to have a print run of 50, for example, you could do it 50 times. Now, the printing is exactly the same thing as the printing for engraving. The difference between engraving and etching is the way in which the metal is removed. And the effort and the tools determine that there's a different quality to the lines of an etching or engraving. So with an engraving, you have a burin, which is a tool that actually removes the metal. It comes out in little curlicues. And you can get painstaking detail. And then you print it just like you will in etching. With etching, the lines are incised with the acid, which dissolves the metal. And because you're not cutting into the metal yourself, you're just scratching through a waxy ground, you can have these very free and sketchy lines. And once again, the printing is identical. Now, here we're looking at a work by Rembrandt. It is Christ on the cross, or a Calvary scene. And it goes by a name. It pretty much has a title today because it's always called The Three Crosses, done in 1653. There are 4 surviving states of this print. When we say that a print has a state, it means the different versions. For example, you could go in and you can etch it and then you could print it. And you look at that and maybe you want to make some changes. I'm assuming you are the artist here. So the artist looks at it and he wants to make some changes. So he goes in and he might use a burnisher, which is a tool that presses down the metal and removes the lines to remove anything he doesn't want. Or he might say, oh, I'm going to add more, and he does the whole etching process again and changes things and adds things to it. And you can do this over and over and over again. Sometimes the states are just preparatory. He wants to see what he has before he goes any further. Other times, it might be that, he actually is using these as 3 different versions of the work of art. So here we're looking at the first state. And incidentally, there are different museums who hold different, there's not just one first state. There's different museums that have copies of the first state. Some of them are on paper. Sometimes you'll find them printed on vellum. So he evidently had experimented with trying different surfaces. I've seen some of the museums will say some of them are just etching. Others will say it's etching and Drypoint. So let's look at this. The tenebrism is this dramatic light that is shown. So it's rather interesting. He's using a very sketchy line, very free. I mean, it's all line. It's a printmaking medium that uses line, and yet I'd say it's as painterly as you can get using line. So there is essentially I want to put in quotes, a painterly quality, the sketchy quality. And you can see the radiance of light that shines down from heaven and illuminates the center. And then he's building up on the sides a darker area. But it's not done yet. This is the 4th state. And as you see here, the tenebrism is extremely strong. Before, he's just starting it. Now you have this dramatic light coming from heaven, shining down on Christ and the figures that are around him. And then you have these very, very deep, deep shadows. He also employs another technique. It's called Drypoint. And once again, you use a metal plate. Neither of these techniques are new to Rembrandt, I should say. We have dry points from the 15th century. We know that, for example, Durer did a few experimental etchings. Not very many, but a few. So, Rembrandt's using them. He's not inventing them. I want to make that very clear. But you're using your piece of metal again, copper, probably, maybe zinc. And you're going to have a Drypoint needle, which is a stylus that is used to scratch directly into the metal plate. Now, what's the difference between that and engraving? With an engraving burin, you are removing the metal. With a dry point needle, you are displacing the metal. The metal's still there, but what happens is you have a groove with a rough surface on either side. It's called a burr. And that rough metal will also hold ink. So when it's printed, it leaves a velvety line. Now, you can't print as many good images with a dry point as you can with an engraving or with an etching, because every time you run it through the press, the burr is pressed down and becomes less velvety. So you could only get a few really, really good dry point images. I suppose you could re-scratch it maybe if you wanted to do that. But it does have certain qualities about it, that deep, rich line that are very attractive to printmakers. Dry point prints like an etching or an engraving, but there's fewer good images because the printing will flatten the burr. So here's our comparison. With etching, lines are incised by acid, which dissolves the metal. With dry point, lines are incised with a tool, a dry point needle, that displaces the metal but leaves a rough burr in the metal on either side of the groove. With etching, your lines are free and sketchy. With the dry point, you can also do some pretty sketchy lines, but it also has that added quality of a velvety line where you have that extra ink in the burr. It makes a very rich, deep tone. And the printing is identical. You have to have one of these roller presses. Now I'm going to show you all 4 of the states of Rembrandt's 3 crosses. This is the first state, and you can see it's still a lot of light areas, but you can see how very scribbly the lines are. It's very, very free. Dare I say painterly when it's a print. And here are some details. You see the area where you have the soldier, and it's building up these dark areas. There may be some dry point in that, where you get this deep and rich tones with all the hatching going on. And then you can see the areas where, it's still pretty clear, where you just have sketchy lines. The holy women around the collapsed Virgin Mary, John standing with his hands to his head, the followers of Christ who have remained faithful and are beneath the cross. And here is a second state. It's on vellum, and you can see he's added a lot of dark forms to it. It's probably building up with dry point. Which leaves, and you can use, of course, you can etch something and then add dry point to it, so you can have this combination, and you get those velvety dark areas. And then, of course, here's the third state, and then we want to see the fourth state, where he's built up with these very, very dark areas. He's used probably used a lot of dry point. I thought this would be useful. We have two versions here. I think the first one is the first state, and then one of the later states. And you see Christ hanging on the cross, and you can see how the dark areas are being built up with all of this cross hatching, and you can see areas that just, the burr is holding the ink. You can also see some of the changes he's made. The helmet of the soldier, for example, has lost a plume. And you have a lot of shadow around that area. And just to show you the technique with something else, this is Rembrandt's Sacrifice of Isaac, in which he is combining etching and dry point, and some of the details.